All right, guys, let's get on here with Section 4 of Industrial Revolution Part 2. Now we're going to get into some specific processes and other items about the Industrial Revolution that kind of made it unique, especially for the U.S. Start with the Bessemer process. Now this was a steel-making process started by another British guy, Henry Bessemer. What it did is it made steel even better. Okay, it used a combination of high heat, various chemicals, supercharged blasted air, moved very fast. And what it did is it blasted impurities out of the steel so that it made it more pure and stronger. Now, what it led to was the mass production of steel. And steel would eventually be used in just about everything that needed to be built. Buildings, the strength of the steel allowed skyscrapers to rise up from the ground and touch the sky. Bridges, and eventually, once we got into the 1900s, automobiles, cars. Okay, this is a surviving Bessemer converter. It's not used anymore, but it is basically a museum piece. As you can see, it's kind of a tourist attraction too. Okay, another little video.
Making steel in massive quantities was one of the great technological challenges of the Industrial Revolution. But it turns out that the secret to creating this mega material was known as far back as 300 BC, when it was made in India and Sri Lanka. The trick to creating this metal was in getting the exact right combination of steel's two main components, iron and carbon. But today, steel is everywhere. So how did it become the workhorse of the modern world? The answer is Henry Bessemer. Bessemer was a British scientist who in 1856 figured out an efficient way to turn iron and carbon into steel. He did it by using hot blasts of oxygen inside a specialized furnace to reduce the amount of carbon in the metal.
The Bessemer process made steel production far more efficient than it ever had been in history.
If you want to make good, high-quality steel, you blow pure oxygen through the iron, and this oxidizes the carbon that is in the iron.
With temperatures over 2,000 degrees, the oxygen is literally burning the carbon out of the steel. Every day, 17,000 tons of iron ore pours into the furnaces at the ArcelorMittal steel mill in Cleveland, Ohio. And each year, this sprawling 1,000-acre facility single-handedly cranks out enough raw steel to build a train track around the globe.
This plant is the most efficient integrated steel plant anywhere in the world.
There's always a hot stove on line.
Foundries like this one use extreme heat and heavy machinery to blast away impurities from the iron ore and infuse carbon, creating a metal stronger, more flexible, and less dense than iron. Turning low-grade ore into the most used metal in the world starts at a 200-foot-tall furnace. This is where the iron ore is hit with heat generated by a type of fuel called coke.
Coke is a result of burning the impurities and the junk out of coal that you don't need to get to the good stuff, which is going to burn cleanly and give you the nice, hot, clean fire that you need to make steel.
It's called the blast furnace because as the ore and coke flow downward, they're met by a 1,600-degree blast of hot air, moving at 110,000 cubic feet per minute.
The wind is coming in at what we call the Bosch level of the furnace through nozzles, which are called tweers, and we have 18 of them, depending on the size of the blast furnace. That air is pushing up through a solid burden material.
The superheated air ignites the coke, like charcoal in a grill, and heats up the furnace to nearly 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the oxygen is finally blasted away, leaving pure molten iron. But it's also doing something even more amazing. As the heat from the coke flame strips away the oxygen, the carbon in the coke is bonding to the iron.
You have hot flash going in, you have the material going in at the top of the furnace, and it's melting, and as it's melting, it's going down.
Under the extreme heat, the mixture liquefies. Impurities like silica and sulfur rise to the top. The heavier iron sinks to the bottom, where it's drawn out in a glowing molten stream.
The furnace until it turns into liquid, and it comes out the tap hole.
Every 45 minutes, some 500 tons of molten metal, called pig iron, gushes from the tap. It's called pig iron because it was originally cast into molds resembling piglets suckling a sow. But ironically, though the iron has been freed from the oxygen, the molten pig iron that flows from the furnace has a new problem: too much carbon. Over 4%, which makes the resulting metal much too brittle. To become steel, that number needs to be reduced to less than 2%.
It's all one continuous process.
We want a very specific strength level. We need the carbon in a very critical range.
To get it right, the carbon-loaded pig iron must undergo one final treatment in the oxygen furnace. Inside this iron cask, the molten steel, already at more than 2,000 degrees, is blasted with jets of pure oxygen. The molten steel ignites the oxygen, only this time the fuel isn't coke. It's the actual carbon atoms bonded to the iron. Basically, the molten material itself is burning.
We blow 25,000 cubic feet of oxygen per minute into the bath in the vessel. The oxygen reacts with the carbon and reduces the carbon level.
The longer and hotter it burns, the more the carbon burns away. The molten metal that pours from the chamber is now a perfect blend of soft iron and brittle carbon. A metal that is strong but ductile, hard but malleable, and forms into solid glowing slabs, ready to span rivers and plow through the ocean. This is steel. But the steel is still red hot, with a temperature over 1,000 degrees. So the metal is transferred to a series of casters and rollers, where it's cooled with water and reduced from 75,000-pound 9-inch slabs to a ribbon just 3/4 of an inch thick. The entire furnace process takes just 2.5 hours to turn the natural mined substance of iron ore into the world's most widely used high-strength metal.
We're very proud. Without us, a lot of stuff can't be made.
All right, so some good stuff there about steel. Very, very strong metal, and a lot of that process started with, well, most of that process started with Henry Bessemer. So again, guys, technology at progress, or the technology at work, technology at work that we are still using today, decades and even centuries later. All right, next, moving on to other systems within industrialization. Entrepreneurs and corporations. Now, an entrepreneur is an investor who uses their own money to start businesses, plain and simple. There's a high risk of losing that money if the business fails, but there's also the other side, high reward if the business survives. They can get paid a lot because they make a return on their investment, plus a little extra. Now, usually entrepreneurs don't just sit on that money, they use money from successful businesses to keep starting more businesses, opening up new investments, generating and expanding wealth. Some of the modern entrepreneurs most of us have heard of: Walt Disney, Lucas, Stan Lee, one of the creators of Marvel Comics, Sam Walton, founder of Walmart, Wally Amos. How many of you have had famous Amos cookies? Wally Amos. Bill Gates, Oprah Winfrey, Donald Trump, Will.i.am, and Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg are just some of the other names. Mark Zuckerberg, of course, being the founder of Facebook. Now let's take a look at corporations. Now corporations are businesses that are owned by stockholders. So these are people who purchase portions of the company. These are called shares. And what they do, they share in the profits of the company. However, they're not personally responsible for any of the debt of the company. So it can be a pretty nice way to go. So what will happen is someone will invest their money in a business. They will purchase shares of the business, hoping for a return on their money. So often these stockholders are also called shareholders. However, these kinds of investors are different from entrepreneurs because, number one, they didn't start the business. They are just buying a portion of an existing business. Now, outside of the original investment, the money that they originally put in, they don't have any other risk. And they also have no personal risk if the business fails. They just simply lose their original investment. Now, corporations will use stockholder money, shareholder money, to expand the businesses or even create more businesses. So this money that flows in, it just doesn't sit like in a bank. It's used over and over and over again to keep business going, to keep generating and spreading out more wealth. Now, some of the most famous corporations in American history were Rockefeller's Standard Oil and Andrew Carnegie's Steel Company. And many of you have probably heard of these names anyway, Rockefeller and Carnegie. Very famous American entrepreneurs that their legacy is still around because Standard Oil was the first large oil company. Now today we have lots of different oil companies, but they kind of all started with Standard. And then Carnegie's U.S. Steel Company was one of the first and biggest steel producers and distributors. Okay, there's Rockefeller on the left, Carnegie on the right. Okay, another quick little video, this one on corporations.
The primary entity or institution of the free market economy is the corporation. The corporation is a legal entity which has as its goal the production of specific goods and services to make a profit. It is a major user of resources and labor. Here are some corporations you may be familiar with. Starting a corporation is a rather simple matter. Corporate attorney David Walder explains how it's done.
First, we must decide whether it's a for-profit or a non-profit corporation. Then we need to draft the articles of incorporation, where we need to include the important information for the basic structure of the corporation, such as the name of the corporation, the number of shares that the corporation is authorized to issue, the names of the initial members of the board of directors, as well as the name of the registered agent and the registered office. At that point, you file the articles along with the appropriate filing fee with the appropriate Secretary of State for the state of incorporation. After that, there would be an initial board of directors meeting where the directors would meet and adopt bylaws and decide how many shares to issue and to whom, usually for consideration. And the shares usually would be common shares. They would be, though the corporation could have additional option to issue restricted or any other types of shares that would assist the corporation in its goals.
Well, we've got several engineering functions.
For the day-to-day running of a corporation, there are officers who govern the company. The principal one is the president. There are also vice presidents, treasurers, and secretaries. Here is a bank president and the president of the bus plant we saw earlier.
Okay, so just some quick information on corporations. All right, now we move into the juiciest section of this video lecture, the jungle. Okay, so The Jungle was a fictional story, a novel by a gentleman named Upton Sinclair. And what it did is it followed the adventures and the experiences of a young Lithuanian man from Europe who emigrated to the U.S., got a job in a Chicago meatpacking plant. What The Jungle did is it introduced the nation to the negative side of industrialization. Many people weren't all that savvy on what was going on with industrialization. The horrors of working in factories, the dangers, the pollution, all that stuff. It was white noise in the background that no one was really paying attention to until The Jungle was published. It highlighted dirty and unsafe factories, sloppy or non-existent food, sanitation in food and meat processing. Okay, so men working with dirty hands. All right, meat falling on the floor. All right, we'll go over some more of those details here in just a second. Pretty nasty stuff, though. Now, eventually, what The Jungle did is it caused such an outrage that Congress started paying attention, and some new offices were created in the federal and in the state governments to try to improve the quality of food products that were coming out of all kinds of factories and industries, not just meat. And so one of these, several of these acts and offices that were created were the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, the Meat Inspecting Act, and, as we know it today, the Food and Drug Administration, which is still around. Okay, we have cattle, and then can't tell if these are sheep or I don't think they're pigs. They're either sheep or something like that. But yeah, this is how cows were kept. Armor Meats. This company in the background here was a very, very huge name in meat packing and processing for many, many decades. I don't think it's around today. Now, this is, you don't have to write anything down here. This is just for you to listen to, because this tells you gives you the details of how bad it really was. And this is an excerpt directly from The Jungle, and this was based off of direct research that Upton Sinclair did, first-hand knowledge of what was going on in these meatpacking plants. Cut up by the 2,000 revolutions a minute flyers and mixed with half a ton of other meat, no odor that ever was in a ham could make any difference. There was never the least attention paid to what was cut up for sausage. There would come all the way back from Europe old sausage that had been rejected and that was moldy and white. It would be dosed with borax and glycerin and dumped into the hoppers and made over again for home consumption. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor, in the dirt and sawdust, where the workers had tramped and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs. Consumption was what they called tuberculosis back then. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. Dung is poo. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then the rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. Those hoppers would package the meat and send it out to the stores, and that's what people got to eat. That's what they got from their supermarkets. Pretty bad stuff, folks. Pretty bad stuff. All right, quick little video on The Jungle.
In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a novel about the American meatpacking industry.
At the time that The Jungle was written, the plants were horrible places to work. They were full of violence, they weren't clean, and frequently diseased and dead animals were slaughtered and made into food.
Sinclair's novel follows the story of a young Lithuanian, Jurgis Rudkus, who arrives in America seeking freedom and opportunity. He finds work in a prosperous, and as he learns to his dismay, filthy Chicago meatpacking plant.
Think think about an individual coming from a rural agricultural kind of society, whether you think about Jurgis coming from Lithuania or a black migrant coming from the deep south, Mississippi, coming into a large industrial city, working in a mass production industry like meatpacking, Sinclair was riding on the crust of a giant wave of social and economic change that took place in the course of the late 19th century.
Before writing The Jungle, Sinclair spent 7 weeks around Chicago's meatpacking plants. He studied details about the work itself, the home lives of workers, and the structure of the business.
Upton Sinclair went into the plants and he saw dead animals being slaughtered. He saw filth all over the plant. He saw products going into sausage that shouldn't have been there. But more importantly, he came out of the plant radicalized by what happened to the workers, how they got chewed up the same way the food did.
Sinclair used the horrors he witnessed as the basis for Jurgis's fictionalized story. As Jurgis discovers, work in the plant involves backbreaking labor in unsafe conditions. When a worker becomes ill or gets injured, he's cast aside, and hundreds of jobless men fight to replace him. Workers in the pickling room have their fingers eaten by acid. Cooks live in danger of falling into open vats of boiling meat.
It was live or die, sink or swim. So the deadened conditions in the slaughtering house and that death that also permeated the battle between the owners and the workers.
It created this traditional, naturalistic, deterministic story in which human beings, just like the animals that are pulled up the chute in the packing plants, and they are pulled up with this sense of optimism at the beginning, this idea of going to America, becoming successful, leaving behind the problems of Europe, and then they go down just like the animals, and they are processed too.
All right, so from The Jungle, and this is a question that you can use in your left side column for your questions. Okay, and this is something I want you to go back through and review on the video. Which horrors did Sinclair's book reveal about the meat packing industry? Okay, which horrors did Sinclair's book reveal about the meat packing industry? Okay, I want you to discuss 3 to 4 of the horrors that Sinclair's book brought to light about the meat packing industry, and give those details within the body of your notes based on this little video clip. Okay, once you're done with that, then go ahead and we're actually going to do a 5th section of video. That way it breaks things up a little bit here. So this will end section 4 of part 2, Industrial Revolution. We will now move on to section 5 next.